Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouts. You know Larry Elder? He's been around for a while. Smart man, nice man. He writes a little article in WorldNetDaily.com. He says there's a large percentage of Americans with black skin, Larry Elder's a black man, who are gravitating to radical Islam, largely for identity and for power. He says they need an education. He illustrates with actor Morgan Freeman. And he says Morgan Freeman is quite willing to give them the education they need. Morgan resents having black history relegated to 1 month a year. He wonders how we're going to get rid of racism as long as we keep talking about it. He insists he's not a black man. He is Morgan Freeman, meaning he doesn't derive his identity from the color of his skin nor his history. Larry Elder says after years of Black History Month, we still know next to nothing about black history. And he wants us to understand, so he goes back to another black man, an economist, Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell wrote, "More whites were brought as slaves to North Africa than were blacks brought as slaves to the United States or to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. White slaves were still being brought and sold, brought and sold in the Ottoman Empire decades after blacks were freed in the United States. This includes the huge role played by Arab Muslim slavers, something we're not permitted to talk about. It's not politically correct. As to the Arab Muslim slave trade, Ghanaian professor and minister John Azuma helped set the record straight in a book he wrote called The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa. In an interview about the book, he said, "While 2 out of every 3 slaves shipped across the Atlantic were men, the proportions were reversed in the Islamic slave trade. 2 women for every man were enslaved by Muslims. Number one, while the mortality rate of the slaves being transported across the Atlantic was high as 10%, the percentage of the slaves dying in transit in the trans-Saharan and East African slave market was a staggering 80 to 90%. Politically incorrect to mention that to a Muslim. Secondly, while almost all the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were for agricultural work, most of the slaves destined for Muslim Middle East were for sexual exploitation as concubines in harems and for military service. Thirdly, while many children were born to the slaves in the Americas, the millions of their descendants are citizens in Brazil and the United States today, while very few descendants of the slaves who ended up in the Middle East survived. Fourthly, while most slaves who went to the Americas could marry and have families, most of the slaves destined for the Middle East were castrated, and most of the children born to the women were killed at birth." He says, quote, "It is estimated that possibly as many as 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, 95% of which went to South and Central America, mainly to Portuguese, Spanish, and French possessions. Only 5% of the slaves ended up in what we call the United States today." Conclusion? A minimum of 28 million Africans were enslaved in the Muslim Middle East. Since at least 80% of those captured by the Muslim slave traders were calculated to have died before reaching the markets, it's believed that the death toll from 1,400 years of Arab and Muslim slave raids into Africa could have been as high as 112 million people. Larry says Mr. Freeman is right. Black history is American history. It ought not be relegated to a month. And at the same time, slavery ought not to be relegated to only the European slave trade. The truth about slavery includes the long, extensive, and deadly role played by Arab and Muslim slavers. And it is equally amazing that so many black Americans are now being drawn to Islam. I don't know who's laughing about this. I don't know who is sitting off in the bleachers watching all this unfold over all these centuries and saying, "You poor benighted souls, you just don't get it, do you?" But that's who we are. We don't get it. We don't know history. And we don't care. Do you?